Hi, in this video I will explain how to tune your derailleurs on bicycles with derailleurs and gears, and how to fix your shifting to make it work properly. And this will be a real life example with all the real life problems, like my dog ate my homework. I'm joking. And because I see a lot of videos on YouTube and instructions that are like perfect, everything works from the start and everything is nice and logical, but in real life there are some problems, and I often get a lot of questions about fixing shifting and tuning derailleurs from people all around the world. And that is why I decided to make a very long, very tedious video that you will use when all else fails. So I urge you to take a look at ParkTool YouTube channel, which is brilliant, really, I love it, and all the other channels that you enjoy, and if any of that helps you, it's great. This is going to be the last resort. That is my intention, so I will try to make it structured, logical, with all the sections put in the video's timeline, and in the description of the video you will have a table of contents, so you can skip to the parts of interest to save you at least some time. But I will try to encompass and explain all the caveats, all the gotchas and problems that happen when you're trying to make your shifting work properly. And so we will start first by pointing to my video that I will link in this video's description, that is named How to Shift Gears on a Bicycle or something like that. I don't remember the exact name, but that is the essence. You'll figure it out. There I explain the proper shifting technique among all the other things, and maybe that is what's causing the problems. Maybe you're not shifting the gears properly, or maybe you're too severely cross-chaining, and I won't get into that. Take a look at that video. It's also very long and boring, but at least useless. And this video, if you conclude that the problem is not with your shifting technique, and in that case you can watch this. So let's begin. The whole system of the bicycle drivetrain and gearing is interconnected, and one thing affects the other things. It's not like oh, I need to fix my rear derailleur and I fix it and it still doesn't work. Well, maybe there is some other problem. If there is some other problem with your shifting cables or something else, or we'll get to that later, you might never be able to tune it perfectly, even if you conclude that your front derailleur is perfectly tuned. If it is not, maybe the front derailleur is causing the problems. So let's get first to all the important things that play a part and that can cause headache and problems. I'll start from the front part of the bicycle and go all the way to the rear, among other reasons because I'm one of the most absent-minded people that I've met, so to not forget to mention anything important. And as always, you will have to put up with my Tarzan English, yes, very wonderful, and with the background noises. So let us begin. Now, when you look at the front of your bicycle, you have shifters. They are usually indexed, so they have clicks, and some are friction shifters that are just have levers that are moved back and forth, and they pull and release gear shifting cable. And while these index shifters that most bicycles today have clicks that release or pull exactly preset amount of cable. And that can be the first problem, because when you press this button, this shifter releases a certain amount of cable, and depending on your rear derailleur, it will move less or more laterally for the same amount of cable pulled or pushed or released, sorry. So that is called the rear derailleur movement ratio, and it needs to be compatible with your shifters. If it is not, then you will have misalignment in the shifting and never be able to fix your shifting, to tune it, at least using indexed shifters. I have a series of articles about compatibility, and I will link the index of those articles in this video's description. and that is the first cause of problems that some people face. So if your front shifter is for 9 speeds, you need to find a rear derailleur that is compatible with 9 speeds shifters. And sorry, not front shifter, I mean rear shifter, but front part of the bicycle. Okay, if your shifter is for a certain number of speeds, you need to use a derailleur that is compatible with that shifter and use the cassette for that number of speeds. If any of those things are mismatched, you will have problems that cannot be fixed to work satisfactorily. So that's the first possible problem cause. The second one is the housing. There is a difference between shifter and brake housing. I have another article that explains that I will also link in this video's description, but the basic idea of shifter housing is that it has, I will show it. Okay, here we have 2 samples. This one is shifter housing, this one is brake housing. Apart from the difference in outer diameter, which is obvious with this case, but sometimes shifter housing can be of larger diameter on the outside. I've seen some 5mm wide models, but the main difference is that the brake housing has this spiral strong metal like sort of skeleton. Inside there is a plastic sleeve, and outside there is this plastic casing to protect it from rust and dirt, while the shifter housing has these like longitudinally placed steel wires that are relatively thick, and has this plastic sleeve in the middle and outside also the protective layer. And now when you push or pull cable, this brake housing can sustain very high force that you use when braking, very high compressive force, but it does have some small amount of compression and then release as the cable moves, and that can cause the shifting to be imprecise, while the shifter cable cannot sustain very high force because the cable that you use for brakes, if you use this as a brake housing, the shifter housing will have that cut through the plastic inner sleeve and go in between these wires, and you will lose your braking force. So it's dangerous to use shifter housing for brakes, while it is perfect to use it for shifting. And that is why it's important to have the right choice of housing and also the right choice of cables. That is another problem that could be caused. For example, Campagnolo has a different diameter of their shifter cables, especially the ends, compared to Shimano and SRAM compatible ones. And of course you don't want to try and push brake cable for your shifting. I think that's more obvious because the ends are very, very large, so they won't fit into most shifters. But if you manage to do that, that could also be causing problems. I've seen everything, so this video deals with every possible complication that you could face. Never underestimate the ingenuity of creative people. Okay, we're going on. So let's say we've chosen the compatible shifter. We have good quality shifting housing and good quality shifting cables. Then we have another thing to consider, that is the wear and tear, because shifting cables can fray, and let's show that as well. Here we have a shifting cable for Shimano, works for both road and MTB bicycles, and you see that it has a lot of smaller, thinner strands all wound up to create a strong cable that is also very flexible and won't easily break from material fatigue. That is why the many strands are used for these cables. Same goes for brake cables. Anyway, these strands can over time wear, there can be some rust, and they can break and get stuck inside the housing. So this moves freely, but you can have it get stuck inside, either because of some rust or dirt buildup, or because there's something frayed. So when you are facing problems, they can also be caused by having some dirt or damage on the shifter cable. The way to fix that is to release the cable. Let's take this example of the rear. You have to release it, cut off the end so it can be moved freely, and take it out and have a look. It's best to replace it anyway after that, but if you try to put it back in, you can put some solder at the end to make it not fray, so you can easily put it in. And for the housing, a trick I use is like this very thin, like you can use WD-40 or some very thin lubricant and just spray it inside the housing to come out of the end and push all the dirt out, or put a new housing in to solve problems caused by that. I will later get on to how to diagnose what causes the problems. Now we're just going over what can cause the problems. Another thing is the housing ends. When you're cutting housing and routing it, I will put a link to an article on my website that explains the choice and the routing of housing, so I don't take too much time on the video, but this, having something like this is good to make the end be more round and to not cause any drag or problems. Okay, if that is all correct, we have another thing to consider, that is the routing of the housing and the cables. And if you put too many angles, I'll use this as an example. Friction of the cables increases as the total angle increases. What do I mean by total angle? Here we have like 180-degree angle total. This, if we route it like this, it's 360 degrees angle, and depending on the diameter, we might cause the cable to get stuck and be very difficult to slide. Okay? Diameter is important, but more important thing is the total number of angles. That is something that many people don't understand. It's measured, and the experiment is shown in my article that is linked. And another thing to just demonstrate, I'm not sure if it's visible, so I'll try it like this. This is 180 degree, this is 360, okay? And this is also 360. So all the winds you have, and modern bicycles have, usually for road bicycles, I've seen they make the cables run internally under the bar tape, or even inside the bars, the handlebars that are road bars that are bent. So you have at the very start a huge penalty when it comes to shifting performance and cable drag. So it's not without a cost. So in that case, everything needs to be really in perfect shape and perfectly tuned, because you start with a potential problem. So that is just one thing. And if you're still awake, let's move. So say we have good cables, good routing, compatible shifters and everything. What else could be causing the problems? We'll start with the drivetrain. Okay, here we have the front chainrings and the rear chainrings. It is important to have the midsection of the front chainrings. If you have two, it's the line between the two front chainrings. If you have three, like in this case, it's the mid chainring. It needs to be, when you're looking at the bicycle's longitudinal axle, it needs to be completely centered relative to the cassette's midsection. If that is off, either by chainrings being too far out or too far in, or the cassette, depending on how you look at it, you might have problems shifting. So that is explained in my article discussing bicycle chainline, which I will also link. So you have like 1 month of reading and learning material in order to fix your bicycle derailleurs, but again, this is in case all else fails. That is another thing that could be causing the problem. Next comes the chain and the chainring wear. If your chain is elongated or worn or stretched, as people say, though that's not technically correct term, you will have it be very resistant to moving correctly, especially when shifting in the rear, because when the rear derailleur tries to move it, worn chain flexes a lot more laterally. So moving these lower links, I'm not sure if it can be caught on the camera, moving these lower links will not pull on the top links where the chain of the where the gear shift needs to happen. So it will not pull the chain quickly enough to make a gear shift, and you will have slow shifting or no shifting at all. Just hear that scratching noise that is annoying. So that is another thing to be mindful. The simplest way to measure chain wear, I will also link to the article explaining the chain wear and when it needs replacing, but this is the simplest tool to measure it. It exaggerates any problems. So having this fall in means that I should just measure it with the ruler to make sure, because this includes roller wear when it gives results, and roller wear is completely irrelevant for chain's performance. And I have another article showing that, explaining that, which I will also link. So about 100 articles if you want to know the details. Anyway, check if your chain is worn or the cassette is worn and replace those, because that worn chain will not allow you to have good shifting generally. Next thing, worn chain rings, since I said would move from front to the rear, or a lot of play in the bottom bracket in your bearing of the cranks. So if either of those two is problematic, you will have problems shifting. And movement of the front derailleur while you're pedaling can also affect and move chain and make it more difficult to shift even in the rear in some extreme cases. So that's another thing to pay attention to. Worn chainrings also tend to keep the chain stuck, so they will not release it. They will happen like this, then click, then again, and that can cause also shifting problems. That's a diesel, I think. Okay, then we come to the front derailleur. Front derailleur needs to be parallel compared to the line of the chainrings. It needs to be at the height. Here I'm not sure if camera can catch this, but we are looking for 2 to 4 millimeters height. This one is too high. This is not perfectly aligned, but let's take a look here. You see where this chainstay is. If we put the front derailleur any lower, it is likely to scratch and not be able to move. So that's a limit. For situations like this, the way to solve it is to have larger chainrings, unfortunately. But so there are always limits, and you sometimes need to make a compromise. If you want lower gearing, well, shifting on the front will not be perfect because this front derailleur cannot be put low enough. Another thing to consider, and that is explained in my article about front derailleur compatibility, is whether the angle or the way front derailleur is put, whether the angle is the right one to follow this curve, whether this curve of the cage is the correct one to follow the curve of the front chainrings. Here you can see that this is a lot lower curve compared to the chainrings, and this crank is probably put later on this bicycle to get lower gearing, and the original crank is probably with a higher number of teeth and larger chainrings on this bicycle. So that's another thing to consider when having problems with front shifting. That is the matching of the front derailleur shape, angle, and distance from the front chainrings. Then we come to the tuning of the front derailleur, and it's the same situation for the rear derailleurs. You have the low screw that limits how close to the bicycle the front derailleur can move, and the high screw that limits how far out it can move. And by tightening these bolts in this direction, like clockwise, you are further limiting. And what you want to do is to make sure that the derailleur can move far enough to make a shift, but not far enough to pull the chain off the chainring so it drops and gets damaged, or something on the bike gets damaged. So that is another thing to do when you're tuning the derailleur, and we'll get to that later. But now just to note it. Further on, moving to the rear, we have this hanger This is called the hanger, where the rear derailleur is placed. If it is at an angle, slightly bent, like you hit the bicycle or drop it, then it will get bent and you will never be able to have proper rear shifting until this is straightened. It is done using a tool like this one that gets screwed in here instead of the derailleur. It's moved out, and then you can see and measure the angle relative to different positions on your rear wheel and see if it is always relatively equal. If it is not, you will use brute force to straighten it and have it fixed. Only after you do that will you be able to fix your rear shifting, and this is often the cause of problems. Probably most often when people have problems, they cannot figure it out. I've tried everything. Well, try this. Get a tool like this or make one yourself. It's a relatively simple thing to do, and it will help you solve the problem. With a note, when you're doing this, hangers are designed to brake before anything else on the frame breaks. So if you drop your bicycle, they're designed to not be strong enough to bend your frame and have you change the entire frame, even to preserve the rear derailleur. So they very easily bend, and they're usually made of aluminum. And the problem with that, as explained in my article about bicycle frame materials, that I will also link, is that it can become more brittle the more you bend it and back and forth. So when you're straightening your derailleur hanger, if it is not made of steel, if it is made of aluminum, you run the risk of making it brittle or breaking. So I have fixed these things in the past, but generally my advice would be find a matching new hanger and replace the hanger with a new one, which is often very difficult to source because for some reason every manufacturer has a different shape of this on every model of their bicycle practically. So it's very frustrating and nonsense in my opinion. The word standard is not applicable here. So you can find someone who is good at machining to make you a new one, or you can try straightening it if you cannot source a proper one. And when you're buying a new bicycle, try to see if they will sell you straight away 2 or 3 extra of these, because they come in handy and save you a lot of time and hassle. If you have to straighten it, pay close attention to do it in one movement when you see which angle is off using that tool I just recently showed. Try to make it in as few attempts as possible to not have it become too brittle, and pay attention in the following weeks of riding to see if there are any cracks emerging. Look at it from all sides, clean it. I've done this in the past a lot of times with no problems, but they can become problematic. And if it breaks during riding, this will all get wound up, and you might then damage your frame and derailleur and perhaps even spokes of the wheel. Okay, and finally we come to the rear derailleur. Rear derailleur has several pivots where it moves. It moves in this direction, and it has this pivot to keep the chain tension, and it moves laterally to do the shifting. All these movements are important, and it shouldn't have too much play. This one has a not insignificant amount of play, but it's not bad, and it provides some resistance, so it will not be too wobbly, but sometimes it can. You have to also inspect for any damage. And these are all the problems that you can face. I don't think I've missed anything. If I have, I'll again use it, put it in the video comment, in description, sorry. And now we come to how to tune it, the fun part. And we'll start with the front derailleur, but first some general talk. Okay, I think this is long enough. I will make a separate video explaining how to tune the derailleurs, and I will link it to it in this video's description. And if you have any problems with tuning derailleurs, you can get back to this and see if there is some major, more critical problem. But when it comes to tuning, that is explained in the separate video. Thank you for watching, and cheers.